business community, if you go 10, 20 years back, was finding nature an interesting topic, but not really knowing on how to deal with it. And I'm still talking to very large corporations which still say biodiversity, bio what? So there is still a language issue. Now, the good news is when we start talking about nature, people can relate much better to that. And so in our business and biodiversity program, we've just laid out 3 very simple steps. The first one is value biodiversity or value nature, if people prefer the nature word rather than biodiversity. And it's basically making sure that people understand there are impacts on biodiversity, but much more importantly, there are a lot of dependencies. Yep. And it's making them integrating the problem of nature not as a CSR, as a corporate social responsibility or as a communication topic, but really integrate it and thinking about it. How much do I depend on nature, and what can I do about it to actually be more positive? And that's very interesting because we now see an upsurge of a nature positive movement coming up as well. So that's very encouraging. The second line is what we call deliver biodiversity net gain. So it's actually being able, as a corporation, to demonstrate that you can actually be biodiversity positive. You can do things, even if you're a mining company or a construction company or an agri-food company. And by actually having these very tangible projects, concrete examples, sometimes small skills, but hopefully they can be scaled up, then you can demonstrate that, yes, actually, I'm a good citizen as a corporation, and I can contribute to this overall movement to really integrate nature more formally in our business models. And hopefully, it will also trigger some thoughts within, and let's not be candid about it, the oil and gas companies, for example, to really rethink their models as well. And actually thinking, well, do I need to continue to pump out fossil fuels out of the ground, or are there actually other solutions? And that's where the energy transition is so interesting, and we see a major shift. And then our third step is that invest in nature. Or now we want to focus it a bit more on invest in nature-based solutions, where it's actually saying, well, I'm a part of a bigger game. I'm just one of the landscape user next to many other users, where you've got the individuals, the citizens, the cities, the Canton du Valais, and it's actually together that we need to look at what's the optimal use of this finite resources that our planet is. Now, of course, water and the water scarcity is a very good example where you get people to work together, but actually these conversations should happen everywhere and by everybody and at all different levels.
Maybe it's time to sort of take a step back. We as humanity have sort of disconnected ourselves from nature. We have chosen 300 years ago, at the beginning of the industrial age, to measure our performance as society based on short-term profitability. So the models that we have built up are, my company is successful, my life is a success if I make loads of money shortly. And that, you know, I'm sorry to use very simple confederation compared to what economists would talk about, but that is where the system starts getting in trouble. Because if you are measuring just one aspect of the complex phenomenon of the interaction between human and the planet, and when I say the planet, I don't mean just natural resources, I also mean, of course, social and human systems, that's when you get into this dead end, this sort of bottleneck that we are facing at the moment. The pandemic has demonstrated that very clearly. We've spent the last 200 years concentrating on to becoming better and better at what we do. Better in terms of measurement of financial return. So we specialized, we sort of simplified, we went with models. And suddenly comes opposite that vision of humanity, a small little, well, it's not even a living organism, you know, something, a virus. A virus can only survive if it has a host. It does not survive otherwise. And that virus comes, and we are on our knees. The whole system collapses. And I think this is a collapse politically, socially, naturally. I mean, it's interesting to use that as a starting point. And if we want to rebuild the system in a more resilient manner, we will need to change the way we interact with nature in the broader sense. World Economic Forum has published a statistic saying that half of the world GDP depends on nature, and therefore we should include that. I would argue that 100% of GDP depends on nature, but I'm not quite sure that I could demonstrate that. So how are we going to be able to rebuild this economy? I remind you that governments across the planet have decided that to restart the economy, they're going to make huge amounts of money available. I don't know, my latest count is something $14 trillion by governments across the planet. The idea of introducing that into the system cannot be done with the same spoiled system that we had before. We need to introduce new ways of creating the values that are indispensable.
We have a fundamental problem, I think, and André both mentioned it and hinted on it, that we are constantly so fixated on A, profits, and B, short term, that we fail to understand the difference between value and price. Price is what you pay, value is what you receive. Nature delivers huge amounts of value to you every day, which doesn't come through any price-making system, doesn't come through any market, it's just nature. And our inability to understand this fundamental Econ 101 difference between price and value is the source of so many stupidities around the planet. It is just unbelievable. It makes me sometimes feel that, we should rename ourselves. We should stop calling ourselves Homo sapiens, which means wise person, but rather maybe,
Homo stupidus.
Homo stupidus or something like that, yeah. So I think coming back, sorry, digression, but the measurement point is really important. We have to measure the total performance. If we look at any of your different projects, whether it's engineering or biodiversity or whatever it is, if we look at your performance purely from the point of view of how much extra profits did you make for your shareholders this year and stop there, then we won't understand the true impacts of the business model that you are creating. And to capture the impacts of that business model, you need to measure performance of the corporation in a much more holistic way, in a sort of four-dimensional way. What does this business do for shareholders? Sure, important. What does it do for employees, human capital creation, development training, and so on, and downstream? What does it do for nature? Is it adding or is it subtracting to the availability of nature's goods and services over time? This needs to be measured and accounted for and reported. So when you report performance in future, I'm hoping, with the collective efforts of everyone, that the reporting of performance will mean four dimensions, not just profits for shareholders, not just impacts on human health and education and skills, but also impacts on society and impacts on nature. These are all measurable nowadays. Yes, it is complicated. Yes, it's difficult. Get used to it, my friends. Life is complicated and difficult. So this is now the way forward. And I think the more people begin to accept that performance of the company is not just about profits and not just about short term, the easier it will be for us to bring nature to where she deserves to be, which is right up front.
Let's talk about durability. How do we build a human system that will allow us to survive the next generation? We are that close to disaster. And I'm glad to see that some young startups are coming with piecemeal solutions, which we are going to, I hope, be able to integrate into a new way of functioning for society.